Hello, welcome back to Good Nightmare. It's been a little while. I suppose I should give you an update on where I've been and why I've been away. A lot of you who have followed the podcast since the beginning or since even late last year sometime or early last year know that I absolutely adored my cat Maud. He was a huge part of my life for 8 years, and unfortunately last year he was diagnosed with cancer. While cancer can be treatable in cats, in his case it was a very aggressive and unusual type, and it had already spread throughout his body. We decided to forego treatment because we didn't want to prolong his life and have him have to deal with chemo and medication and constant vet trips because he, like most animals, didn't really like travelling in the car and didn't like vets. So we chose to keep him home and give him the best and happiest life possible for as long as we could. From the day of his diagnosis, he lived for about 2 more months. He was affectionate and loving until the very end, and he passed away in my arms, surrounded by people who loved him, which is all you can really hope for anyone that you love when they're passing. After Maud passed, I felt this gaping hole in my heart. My partner and I, we talked about adopting cats that needed a home. We wanted to open up our home to a couple of pets who really needed somewhere to live and needed a forever home where they could settle in and live their best life. And I knew that I could give them all the love in the world, just like I'd given Maud. We didn't think that anything would happen until around now, which is March 2021, because generally speaking, there's usually a waiting list when you put in an application to adopt. And I thought, okay, I'll be ready by then. But very unexpectedly, we were chosen to adopt 2 kittens, 2 little boys who were 3 months old. We named them Uba and Vitsuk after our favourite characters in the show Vikings, and they live up to their namesakes. They are absolutely adorable. They came to us quite unwell, very small in Vitsuk's case, with all kinds of problems. We nursed them back to health, and they are now so well settled in. They climb all over us. They're incredibly affectionate and happy and loving. And we're just very happy to have what feels like a family again. We still miss Morty every day, obviously. I'm still grieving. And that kind of leads into why I chose this particular topic for today's episode. Grief and anxiety and stress can lead to a multitude of problems, from illness to exhaustion to insomnia. And insomnia is how my body chose to cope, or rather not cope. I'm not really sure. So I got to thinking on the nights when I couldn't sleep if insomnia or other sleep disorders had ever caused a crime to be committed or had ever resulted in a crime. Insomnia is a sleep disorder that affects around 1 in 7 adults as a chronic or long-term condition. It can cause difficulty falling asleep, difficulty staying asleep, or it can cause you to wake up too early and not be able to get back to sleep. It's often associated with or the result of a primary disorder, such as depression, anxiety, bipolar, basically anything you can think of. I often, throughout the year, will suffer from insomnia in long bouts, usually about a month or 2 at a time, a couple of times a year. This year, it was throughout the end of January and the start of February. I found it impossible to fall asleep, and when I did, I would wake up again within 30 minutes and not be able to get back to sleep for another few hours. It would go on like this, on and off, every single night, until eventually I stopped trying to sleep and I just sat up awake but too tired to do anything, even to watch a TV show or read a book, until the small hours of the morning when I might catch an hour or 2 out of pure exhaustion before my alarm went off for another day of work. A lack of restful sleep can be debilitating. As you know by now, if you're a long-term listener, I suffer from chronic lucid nightmares. So my sleep isn't great as it is. With insomnia on top of that, it becomes incredibly difficult to function. Thankfully, the cycle broke and I'm back on track for now. As I said, during my sleepless nights, I got to thinking about sleep disorders and whether there were any crimes committed that were caused by or a result of them. I wasn't able to locate any insomnia-related crimes, probably because if it goes on long enough, you become a walking zombie and are too tired to make your own lunch, let alone devise a sinister plot. There was, however, another sleep disorder that had a few related cases: sleepwalking. Homicidal sleepwalking, or homicidal somnambulism, is just as it sounds. It is the act of killing someone during an episode of sleepwalking. There have been cases reported over the years as far back as 1846, though, as you can imagine, a lot of these cases are contested. Without witnessing the act, how can it really be determined that a person was sleepwalking at the time of the murder or the killing? It is important to remember in these cases that to achieve a guilty verdict for murder, the prosecution must prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the murderer had intent to kill the victim, cause bodily harm, or showed reckless indifference to human life. A person can't show premeditation or intent if they're not conscious at the time of the act. In October 1845, the body of Maria Bickford was found in a boarding house. She had been murdered and her room and corpse burned. Her killer was quickly identified as Albert Tyrrell. Tyrrell had apparently visited Maria Bickford frequently before her murder. The pair had been heard arguing, and Tyrrell was seen in the area shortly after the murder and arson occurred. Some of his belongings were also found at the scene. Tyrrell was difficult to track down initially as he had left the area. In fact, he had fled as far as Canada before being arrested when he turned up again in New Orleans. The case was sensationalized in the media, with endless coverage of both the victim and suspected murder. There were pamphlets released with updates and biographies about the two. There were updates that, for their time, would rival our current 24-hour news cycle. Everyone wanted answers. Everyone was intrigued. And in this case, it likely helped Tyrrell's defense. Tyrrell was charged with murder, and his defense lawyers provided 3 possible alternatives to the murderous theory. First, that Maria had slit her throat in an act of suicide. Second, that Tyrrell was simply not the murderer and the person they were after was still out there. And third, that Tyrrell had absolutely been sleepwalking at the time and therefore could not be held responsible. The first 2 theories fall a little short on first hearing them. Because Tyrrell's belongings were found at the scene and suicide was ruled out by the sheer brutality of the attack, including the subsequent arson, Tyrrell's lawyers had to take their chance on a sleepwalking defense. Tyrrell apparently was known for sleepwalking, experiencing nightmares and trances. In the 1800s, little was known about the causes of sleepwalking and what people were capable of while in this state. Tyrrell's lawyer painted a vivid picture of Tyrrell being trapped in a nightmare or a trance, finding Bickford, and acting out his violent dreams against his unsuspecting victim. The defense reminded the jury that if Tyrrell were found guilty of murder, he would surely be put to death. And he argued that if there was even a chance that Tyrrell was innocent, that he committed this crime while sleepwalking, they would be responsible for his death. It was likely due to the sensationalism of the case, as well as its unusual defense, that it took the jury only 2 hours to return a not guilty verdict. This was the first recorded case in which a sleepwalking defense was successful. Upon being found innocent, Tyrrell faded into obscurity and he lived the rest of his life in a way that was entirely uneventful in comparison to this particular chapter. His lawyer, however, remained in the spotlight, in a sense, as he became famous for the use of a successful sleepwalking defense. There have been various other cases over the centuries of homicidal sleepwalking, with one of the most recent occurring in 2008, where a man tragically killed his wife after mistaking her for an intruder while in a sleepwalking state. He was found not guilty of murder. This case is one that I have looked into and watched a documentary on, and it is particularly tragic and heart-wrenching. I urge you to listen to Brian Thomas's story if you are interested in hearing about more contemporary cases. But do be warned, it is incredibly emotional and difficult to watch. I would love to hear from you if you've experienced sleepwalking before and how you feel about this case. Personally, I'm not quite sure I believe him to have been sleepwalking due to the fact that he then tried to cover his crime by setting fire to the body and the room in which Maria was located. I will link my social media in the description. I also have a Patreon, which you are welcome to join or not. It's entirely up to you. It's just a way to support the podcast. My only goal is to reach $20 a month, as that's the cost of hosting and running the podcast. But I, of course, appreciate all of your support that you give me now by interacting and just listening to the podcast and subscribing. That's more than enough. So please do not feel like you have to donate or anything like that. As an aside, I used to update every 2 weeks. At the moment, with the world in the state that it's in and in the state that I'm in, I'm not sure that I'll be able to keep up with that same rigid schedule. But I will be updating as often as I can, and I hope that you will stick around to see some updates. Thank you so much for listening and for sticking around through my break. And until next time, sweet dreams.